Okay, hello. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this talk. My name is Meredith Moore and I'm a curator here at V&A Dundee. And in today's talk, we are joined by Dr. Michael Morris. He is a senior lecturer at the University of Dundee and also a co-investigator on the Transnational Scotland project. So Michael Morris has been working with us at V&A Dundee as a member of our Scottish Design Galleries Advisory Group. So he's been working really closely with us to try to bring out stories of Scotland's relationship to empire and to slavery, and to bring those stories out in our galleries. So in his work, he's really building on the work of historian Catherine Hall and psychoanalyst Daniel Pick's description of the disavowal of slavery. And today he's going to explore projects which reposition thinking to acknowledge Scotland's role in Atlantic slavery, emphasising a willingness to fully see what's always been available. So he's going to be looking at some objects in our Scottish design galleries, as well as some contemporary artworks, films, and walking tours. Really examining art and design's relationship to the avowal and disavowal of Atlantic slavery, while also asking just how effectively cultural and creative projects can navigate and acknowledge that really important history. So before I invite Michael to join us, I just want to draw your attention to some Zoom functions that we have available to use during this talk. So today's talk is being BSL interpreted by Bruce Cameron, as you can hopefully see. You can spotlight Bruce's video by using the three dots on the top right corner of their video box to select Pin Video. If you would like to use the closed captions, please enable this using the CC button located on the bar at the bottom of your screen. Details of how to use these features has also been posted in the chat, so you can have a look there. Questions are really encouraged and welcomed, so please do share any questions that you have throughout the presentation using the Q&A button, which is located on the bar at the bottom of the screen. So I'll keep an eye on those and pick some out for us to address to Michael at the end of his presentation. So we really hope that you might want to chat about this event online. If you'd like to do that, please do tag us at VA Dundee. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand over now to our speaker, Dr. Michael Morris. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Meredith, for that lovely introduction. And I'm just going to try and remember how to share my screen. Can you give me a wee thumbs up if that's working?
Yep.
All good. Great. Okay. Hello everybody. I would like really nice to speak to you this afternoon. I'd like to begin with this image of this valance, which has been used to advertise the talk, because I think that it helps to bring out some of the main themes for this afternoon. So walking into the Scottish Design Gallery, it's a very striking, impressively large drape which hangs in the Scotland and Europe case. It's made primarily of linen with gorgeous wool and silk embroidery. It dates from the kind of end of the 16th century, and it's thought that it came originally from France. So it was designed as a valance or a bed hanging to cover a drafty area and provide warmth and decoration. So it's a profoundly domestic setting in the bedchamber, and the image portrays an elegant, heartwarming scene, which abounds in Renaissance allegories of love and domestic bliss. It may even recall a wedding scene. So you can see in the middle of the valance the image of a golden couple encased in a rose garden. If you run your eyes to the left, we have a trio of female figures. We have Prudence holding a mirror for foresight and wisdom. We have below her, we have Fidelity seated with her dog in her lap. And a further quite stern looking female figure holding what it's quite hard to make it out, but if I'm reading it correctly, it looks to me like the French "Aime ton prochain comme toi-même," as in the key biblical commandment to love thy neighbour as thyself. Now, if you run your eye to the right-hand side of the couple, you find the musicians playing a lute, a flute, and a cello. And the musicians bring a real sense of kind of grace and harmony to this symbolic world of Christian ethics and cardinal virtues. It's designed to warm your soul as well as your bedsheets. However, if we look closer at the musicians, we see that there is another figure who is easy to miss at first glance. We see that what is holding up the sheet notes for the players is a young black boy dressed in page livery, acting as a kind of music stand. It's really quite an arresting sight, and once you see it, it gives a very different feel to this scene. So to help to understand the presence of this figure, we can turn to the monumental art history collection titled "The Image of the Black in Western Art," which contains hundreds of such images. In the preface, Henry Louis Gates Jr. explains the tradition of this kind of single black page boy in scenes such as this one. So Gates notes that already in the late 1500s, such figures had become a fashionable accessory for wealthy households. It was a way of kind of advertising the exotic wealth and the international reach of the household. So Gates explains that in all cases, these images evoke a world as far removed as possible from the reality of the slave plantation in the New World, even though nearly all of the people on whom they were based were transported as slaves directly from the ports of West and Central Africa. So Gates's language of removing, of distancing is important. For this image, I think we might say also that the black figure here seems to add to the allegorical meanings. If we consider the dimensions of the scene as a whole, the boy's eyes are on the same level as the lapdog symbolizing fidelity. So looking closer at the expression on his face, he's quite sanguine. He seems perfectly content with his role. So allegorically then, this figure suggests an added layer to the harmony. This is a world of obedience and servitude, and perhaps more importantly, a black figure apparently content to be shuffled into the corner, playing a supporting role. So what I'd like to do instead then is to flip it round and to imagine instead an eruption in the corner of this scene, which threatens to overthrow its intended meanings. We might read it that the Renaissance aesthetics are propped up and dependent on the raised arms of the young boy. Should he rebel, should he drop his arms for just a moment, the precarious world of meaning by which Renaissance Europe understood itself would come crashing down. So what the talk will do today is to try to use these kinds of objects which have disavowed the role of slavery in the development of European modernity, and we're going to look to flip it round to illuminate some more challenging histories with particular reference to Scotland. Now, in Scotland, there's been over the past couple of decades a growing stream of books and articles and novels, plays, poems, television and radio programmes, walking tours and art exhibitions, which have begun to challenge the nation's neglect of the subject of slavery. So scholars such as Carl Assassi, Tom Devine and myself have borrowed the term collective amnesia from memory studies to try to describe the process of forgetting, historical forgetting. However, that metaphor of amnesia has begun to seem inadequate. Kind of forgetting seems to be maybe too passive and maybe a bit misleading. So I'd like to turn instead to Catherine Hall and Daniel Pick's recent description of the disavowal of slavery across the United Kingdom, which might better suit. So Hall and Pick give a Freudian reading of disavowal, saying that disavowal is the refusal to avow, the disclaiming of responsibility or knowledge of something. Disavowal can be linked to the notion of a blind eye, or the rejection or rebuttal of something in plain sight. so carrying the implication of knowing and not knowing all at once. So I think this is a really important metaphor for art and design. So the authors draw on John Steiner's evocative image of turning a blind eye, which is less to do with remembering and forgetting, but rather it emphasizes that there is a reality which is accessible, but it's ignored, it's distorted and misrepresented, as in the Valence image with the black page boy. So Steiner writes that turning a blind eye also contains a kind of a degree of ambiguity as to how conscious or unconscious the knowledge is. So for myself, this idea of disavowal appeals to me because if I reflect now on my previous work, I see that it was often less the case that slavery was forgotten, and rather slavery was known and represented in each generation, but it was managed in particular ways. And so this more dynamic picture of combined states of seeing and unseeing, knowing and unknowing the violence of empire speaks to, and I quote here, the way we may organize a field of vision or hearing in order not to see or pick up the most disturbing element. So as I say, I think that avowal and disavowal is a very useful concept if we think about Scottish culture as a whole and the role of art and design museums in particular. So before I go any further, I'd like to just emphasise that my background is in literature and history. I'm not a museologist, and I would certainly like to acknowledge the works of groups like Museum Detox, which have really pushed the boundaries of how we think critically about museums and what museums might become in the future. Here in Scotland, there have been calls dating back to at least 2014 for a Scottish museum dedicated to slavery and empire. Following the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, this was raised in the Holyrood Parliament with proposals outlined for a site in Greenock or Glasgow. And the government established a committee on empire, slavery and Scotland's museums. And that committee is currently holding a national consultation. I'll try and get a link to that for you in the chat. So do take part in that national consultation. It seems very important to me. So alongside a standalone museum, there is also a kind of a decolonising perspective which is spreading throughout all museums. And some of this is already bearing fruit. And we can see moves being made at properties involved in the National Trust for Scotland, in Glasgow, the Kelvingrove Art Gallery, the Hunterian Museum, in Edinburgh, the National Museum of Scotland, and the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, here in Dundee, at the McManus, and of course here at the V&A. So I remember years ago speaking about this and being told by museum staff that, well, we'd like to talk about slavery more, but we just don't really have the artifacts for slavery. We don't have the kind of the chains and manacles and whips that you would need, as if they were the only artifacts that can tell us about slavery. So instead of that, today I want to take a virtual walk through the wonderful Scottish Design Gallery and rethink some objects. Now, the opening panel, which greets the visitor, notes that the artefacts are drawn from the, quote, the last 500 years of successful Scottish design. And so just to emphasise then that those very last 500 years have been the high point of European empires, which were motored by the development of Atlantic slavery. One of the points I'd like to emphasise then is that whenever we start to talk about slavery, there will always be quite a quick response. People say, well, only a few rich merchants benefited, but it's got nothing to do with me. Now, very truly, it's a very unequal society, and that wealth was spread very, very unequally. However, it's more insidious than that, and slavery seeped through every corner of national life. So today I want to use the objects to bring that home, literally bring slavery home to the world of domestic accoutrements, bed hangings, tea tables, smoking pipes, gowns and chests of drawers. I want to use the objects to tell a story, one which combines beauty with despair, luxury with exploitation, and aesthetics with resistance. These things are never as separate and as distant as they seem. So I want to keep an eye on that kind of duality and look to avow the presence of slavery in national life, bring it out from the corner of the picture. So we'll pay attention to materials, to production and to origins, which don't, I think, or shouldn't make us diminish the object. Rather, what we're asking museums and galleries to do is to find ways of using the objects to illuminate aspects of slavery in national life and to ask searching questions. So just a quick overview about Scotland and the slave trade, for which we rely very much on Mark Duffel's research, who showed that there were comparatively few slave voyages made from Scottish ports. He can count 27 ships leaving from the ports of Greenock, Port Glasgow, Leith, and not too far from here, Montrose, alongside 4 ships registered in Scotland, which sailed from English ports. And as Duffel points out, that's 31 voyages over a 60-year period, which is roughly equal to the number of voyages sent out from Liverpool in one single year in the 1740s. So that comparatively smaller number is, I think, part of the reason for the disavowal in Scotland. There's not a similar slave port as such on the scale of something like Liverpool or Bristol. However, the story does not stop there. We shouldn't forget, of course, that kind of Scottish diaspora who moved down to ports like Liverpool. For example, the image there is John Gladstone's, who was born in Leith and who became what's known as a Liverpool merchant prince, major owner of enslaved people, and indeed somebody who was a pioneer in bringing across indentured servants from India on the ending of slavery. If you look at the slave compensation database, he's one of the largest recipients of compensation money at the ending of slavery. Furthermore, on top of the actual slave trade itself, we have goods which are produced by enslaved people, and tobacco, sugar, and textile industries have long been seen as central to Scotland's economic growth. However, the enslaved labour on which they depended was often disavowed, distanced from our kind of way of talking about hero merchants. So there's large questions then, originally raised by Eric Williams, of the connection between plantation slavery and capitalism more broadly, which is a question which will hang over this whole discussion. To our objects then. The first object that I'd like to focus on is this quite amazing tobacco snuff mull from the latter half of the 19th century. So snuff was kind of snorted or chewed rather than smoked. We don't see it so much nowadays, but it was particularly fashionable all the way through the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly amongst the upper classes and the aristocracy at first, before becoming more widespread during the 19th century when this one was made. So there were many snuff boxes, which were always kept in pockets, always with a tight lid to keep the snuff dry. That was crucial. This one, though, is not a pocket one. It's really large, and it would have been kept on the table. What we've got is a gorgeous, twisty, winding ram's horn design, which I can only imagine must have been a bit of a conversation piece too, a conversation starter. And we can think here about the kind of the sociability aspect of bringing people into your home and perhaps sharing the amount of snuff that you could fit in something that size. We notice there's emblems of the ram down the bottom and the eagle. So this kind of majestic animal world, which to me speaks of a certain kind of Highland Scottish iconography at the same time. Now, tobacco is particularly important for our story in Scotland. I'd like to use the snuff mill then to think about the role of tobacco, particularly in relation to Glasgow, which dominated the tobacco trade between the 1740s up to the American Revolution. Glasgow merchants developed what was called the Glasgow system, which involved a kind of a cheaper and quicker way of producing and transporting the tobacco leaves. The Glasgow merchants would extend credit to smaller cultivators in backwater areas around the Chesapeake, rather than relying on larger tobacco cultivators already in place. This meant that they were able to undercut competition, and by 1758, Glasgow tobacco imports exceeded the ports of London, Liverpool, Bristol, and Whitehaven combined. A key statistic, I think, is that the highest ever import of tobacco was £47 million, which landed on the docksides in 1761. So by the early 1770s, Scots controlled over half the trade in key areas of slave-produced tobacco. This has been described as Scotland's first global enterprise. What I'd like to flag up then is that the key figures who made their fortunes from this became known as tobacco lords, and they really dominated city politics and social clubs, leaving their names famously on Glasgow streets. People like Andrew Buchanan, who gave their name to Buchanan Street. However, and we have Virginia Place and Virginia Street as well in Glasgow, the geographic source of much of the tobacco. However, it's not just a Glasgow story. We shouldn't forget the likes of John Coutts in Montrose, who was a Lord Provost of Montrose and who made his fortune from slave tobacco as well. Now, it's interesting that there's a celebrated area of the city in Glasgow named the Merchant City, and that title of Merchant City is supposed to, I think, make us think of a kind of a glamorous cosmopolitan elite. And yet, we might think about the actual drug that they were pushing at the time. Tobacco is a particularly addictive and harmful substance, which we're only nowadays beginning to legislate against to try to decrease its use. So we might just rethink these tobacco lords, and rather than celebrating them in the Merchant City, we might think of them instead as a kind of an 18th century drug cartel, ruthless kind of pushers making a profit through extremely ruthless business practices. A little word on disavowal then. Professor Tom Devine really made his career on a study of the Glasgow tobacco lords in the 1970s, which detailed their business practices and their personal lives, and did actually mention slavery at a couple of moments. It's not the case that slavery was completely absent. It is present sometimes in brackets and not a major part of the story. And I just wanted to flag up this image, which is the front cover of I think it's the American version of the Tobacco Lords, in which we do actually see enslaved people on the front cover of that book. And yet, although they're there, although they're visible, although they're accessible in the archives which were used for the book, they're not avowed, right? They're not really fully seen and made the centre of the story. So they're present but marginalised. They're seen and unseen at the same time. To me, this speaks highly of the kind of disavowal of slavery. So rather than that disavowal, I'd like to turn instead then to a recent exhibition by Jimmy Robert, who originally with origins from the island of Guadeloupe, named Tobacco Flower, which took place at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. And this one really looked instead to avow the presence of slavery through different riffs on tobacco in art, in literature, and in politics. For example, using Eddie Morgan's poem on the Last Cigarette, alongside intriguing images from the Caribbean. So this is an example, I think, of trying to develop a seeing eye for the viewer to properly witness and acknowledge and see the presence of slavery. So I turn then from the smoking room and the smoking table, and we might be thirsty after that. So we'll turn instead to the tea table, where we can find amazing objects in the Scottish Design Gallery. I find tea tables really intriguing because we think, well, you know, what could be more British than the tea table? And I think we want to kind of scratch the surface of that and really emphasise the international and global elements of what we like to think of as so apparently British. We've got a variety of objects in the Scottish Design Gallery. We've got this stunning silver bullet teapot, and the silver egg-shaped coffee urn. Just really exquisite items, and both the labels tell us both distinctly Scottish designs. And I'd like to flag up as well this, not silver, but earthenware sugar bowl, really dainty and very, very well made. And we can see there's a decorative aspect to this, but also we imagine that the earthenware might be used for kind of everyday use as well as for entertaining. So these drinks, tea and coffee, certainly have their own imperial connections. Tea we associate with India so much. Coffee comes from a variety of sources, but one of those sources is slave-grown coffee in areas like the Caribbean. But I'm going to focus on sugar to bring out the next aspect of this story. And what I'd like to do is to move from the elegance of the silver and the pot and the kind of dainty pottery to a rather rougher object from another case elsewhere in the gallery. This is the model Canon Gun made at the famous iron foundry at Carron at Falkirk. So it's a dainty little object, this model gun, but as Lisa Williams has pointed out, it was this kind of military hardware which allowed the British Empire to, quote, gain a foothold in the sugar islands of the Caribbean. Furthermore, to add to that, there has been increased attention recently on the role of the Carron Company in making iron sugar pans for use on slave plantations. And I was really pleased to see a blog on that subject recently at the Our Stories Falkirk website, which I hope to provide a link to as well. Now that blog points out that so the Carron Ironworks, which were founded in 1759, but they manufactured their first sugar pans in 1762, only 3 years after the company was founded. And this line of industry provided a steady source of income over decades and centuries, in fact. So the image of the sugar pan there I've given you on the right-hand side would have been transported from Falkirk over to plantations in the Caribbean. Now the sugar trade with the Caribbean, between the Caribbean and Scotland, goes back to the middle of the 17th century. We can find sugar houses founded in the 1660s around Glasgow and Greenock. The image I've given you there is of the harvesting of sugar canes on vast plantations, which have been called kind of early modern factories, and there's been kind of theories that it's really the sugar cane plantations show us the origins of capitalist methods of production and labour discipline. So kind of factories in the fields they've been called. This was, just to emphasise, back-breaking manual labour using machetes to cut the cane, and enslaved people were bedevilled by rats and mice and insects in the cane fields as they were working long, long days to produce a rough kind of sugar. And if they didn't work well enough, they would be subject to severe punishments, such as whipping. Once they had harvested that cane, the cane was boiled up in sugar pans, produced at the likes of the Carron Ironworks in Falkirk. The sugar was then transported to sugar houses here, where we find in towns like Greenock, we find sugar sheds still existing. Greenock became known as Sugaropolis due to its domination of the sugar trade, which is where we find companies like Tate and Lyle. And we might think about something like Tunnock's tea cakes. Tunnock's tea cakes themselves, an icon of Scottish design, with origins tracing back to Caribbean slavery. Now, the immigration out to the Caribbean from Scotland really accelerated after the 1760s, which was the end of the 7 Years' War, and opened up all kinds of colonial opportunities. And it was really after the 1760s when Scotland's economy accelerated. Tobacco and sugar play a major role in this. So after the collapse of tobacco, after the American Revolution, sugar imports increased by about 400%. So just like tobacco lords, this produced vast profits for sugar princes, of whom we can count around 80 individuals, including Walter Philadelph. Walter Philadelph was born in Perth. He goes to Antigua to make his fortune in sugar and slaving. Philadelph becomes a key figure for museums because he sends plants to Hans Sloane, who founded the British Museum. Walter Philadelph retired to Dundee with his fortune, and we can find 3 streets named after Philadelph here in Dundee. I'd also like to flag up that sugar has also a key place in anti-slavery action. So after Parliament rejected the Abolition Bill in 1791, abolitionists decided to bypass Parliament, and they developed a new strategy, which was the boycott of West Indian sugar. So the idea here was that if the politicians couldn't be persuaded, then a consumer awareness campaign would hit the sugar princes in the pocket instead. So abolitionists understood that decreasing the profits gained from the sugar trade would take away the major justification of slavery. And so they developed a kind of a boycott strategy, which was used first in the early 1790s, and it was revived again in the 1820s during the push to abolish slavery in the British colonies. Now, interestingly, the abolitionists targeted their campaign directly at consumers, and in particular, the, quote, middle-class housewife, who the abolitionists believed controlled the purse strings in the house. And it was they who could make the decision over whether or not to buy slave-grown products like sugar. So a figure called William Fox published a highly successful anti-sugar pamphlet in 1791. It became a bestseller. It ran to 25 editions, sold 70,000 copies in 4 months. So in it, he argued that, quote, if we purchase the commodity, we participate in the crime. In every pound of sugar used, we may be considered as consuming 2 ounces of human flesh. So it's quite a gruesome image. Fox gives a vision of cannibalism, that eating sugar is equivalent to eating people. So he was really, I think, managing to kind of close that distance, close that mental gap that we would have, to bring home to the tea table the duality of sugar, the sweetness of the product, but the bitter story of its production. We can find in the Glasgow Courier a letter in January 1792 which continues this theme. And the letter argues that eating sugar was equivalent to taking up a whip in your own hand and actually whipping an enslaved person yourself. So you can see that these were really vivid images that people were using to get the point across. It was an effective campaign, and sugar sales dropped by 1/3 in some parts of the country. It's estimated that by 1792, about 400,000 people in Britain were boycotting slave-grown sugar. I just wanted to emphasize that role of anti-slavery there, because I think nowadays, when we start to do this kind of work, people will often give us a criticism that, oh, well, we shouldn't just look with the eyes on the past or judge history with the eyes of the present, that slavery was just completely accepted in those days. And it's just a kind of it's a kind of a modern political correctness to be doing this kind of work. So I'd just like to reassure those people that in actual fact, slavery was condemned in these kinds of very clear terms, even as it was going on. And so what we're doing nowadays is simply continuing that struggle, continuing that anti-slavery struggle. I can turn then from sugar to have a think about textiles. Because turning to a different case in the Scottish Design Gallery, my eye was caught by this really striking a gown, obviously made for a baby christening at church, and its white elegance speaks of innocence and holiness. Yet the textiles which form the weave, both linen and cotton, are quite removed from that sense of holiness. So what I'd like to do is to use the gown then to talk about slavery in relation to both the linen industry and then cotton. Because as Henry Louis Gates told us, slavery can often seem removed from, at a distance from, objects such as these. Slavery can always seem to be elsewhere. And certainly one thing that I like to say to my students is that in the UK, we often think of slavery as like an American problem, right? It's something which happens over there. And in Scotland, I think we like to think that it's an English problem. Slavery and racism and empire is something which the English did. And within Scotland, I think that we like to say that it's a Glasgow problem, that it's really concentrated in that city. So it's always elsewhere, it's always somewhere else. So just to emphasize then that particularly linen has its own important story for us here on the East Coast. Particularly looms around Fife, Angus and Perthshire could produce this very, very fine, gorgeous linen, like the kind that we saw in the christening gown. However, what was also produced around northeast mills was a cheaper, coarser kind of linen cloth known as Osnaburg linen. This became known as slave cloth because it became so popular for clothing enslaved people, and the Caribbean really became the chief export destination. To emphasize then that this was a particularly rough, scratchy, uncomfortable kind of coarse linen. And the textile historian Sally Tuckett has uncovered accounts by enslaved people themselves who talk about having to put on these shirts and shifts and really emphasizing how horrible the clothes were to wear, describing it as feeling like a prisoner in your own clothes. In terms of the linen industry then, an amazing figure that by the end of the 18th century, 62% of all linen exports went to the Caribbean as, quote, slave cloth. So these were profits made quite literally on the backs of enslaved people. A further very striking figure in relation to exports, by the way, is that by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, by 1815, 65% of all goods exported from Scotland went to the West Indies. We're thinking not only here of textiles, but also of things like herring, as well as the wool industry. The linen industry was overtaken by cotton by the 1780s, which was one driver for the early industrial revolution in the field of textiles. So certainly for the Industrial Revolution, I always think about images of in relation to heavy engineering and shipbuilding, but in truth, it's textiles and mills which lead the way. So a kind of an updated Tom Devine, Devine Mark II, we might say, tells us that until well into the 1790s, Sea Island cotton from the Caribbean provided the leading sector of the Scottish Industrial Revolution, with the vital raw material for its mills and workshops, until being replaced after that period by the southern states of the USA, another slave-based economic system. So some of my own work has been looking at, for example, the model cotton mill at New Lanark and thinking about the slave connections of the New Lanark mill associated with Robert Owen. So a couple of projects to flag up. I'd certainly like to flag up the Nicholas Daly jacket, which is there in the Scottish Design Gallery, in which Daly, who is an artist with kind of Scottish Jamaican heritage, uses fabrics to suggest different stories, and it's well worth checking out. I'd also like to flag up a project called Our Linen Stories, run by John Ennis, who's done marvellous work in making this kind of history public. So raw cotton was picked by enslaved people on plantations in the colonies and transported to be woven and spun by waged workers in difficult mill conditions as part of a new industrial proletariat. For myself, I think that textiles really give rise to a different set of images than the crops of sugar and tobacco, which can, I think, suggest that the fruits of enslaved labour in the colonies are squandered through consumption. And it's consumption of luxury items, right? Kind of slavery dissipates in a puff of smoke, or it dissolves in your hot coffee. If we think about textiles, though, we really have to think about processes of planting and harvesting, ginning, packing, transporting, unloading, spinning, weaving, dyeing, buying, selling, wearing, and repairing of cloth. And this, I think, brings into focus the real processes of labour, networks of exploitation and profit in the circulation of materials which have formed the global capitalist system, which we're shining a light on today. Finally, then, my final object is this really striking pair of drawers, or chest on chest, which is utterly huge and magnificent, made of mahogany, such a rich, deep brown, majestic feel. This piece is designed by Thomas Affleck, who was originally from Aberdeen, but became a key craftsman in Philadelphia, producing pieces in the Chippendale style. You can see this kind of neoclassical design of this one with its kind of temple feel and ornate wreath at the top. Now, mahogany was the most fashionable and sought-after timber of the 18th century, and indeed Philadelphia was the centre of kind of North American fashion and good taste. Affleck is credited with delivering what's widely accepted as the finest of 18th century American furniture, which you can find in galleries and museums across the continent. However, as James Walvin tells us in the book Slavery in Small Things, the mahogany furniture which Americans and Europeans found so appealing was derived overwhelmingly from the sweat of enslaved Africans toiling in the rainforests of the Caribbean and Central America. So Walvin details the labour practices which often involved small gangs of men and women performing the back-breaking work of deforestation with the risk of severe punishments. So Walvin concludes that there's a vast chasm of incomprehension between the crashing sound of a massive felled mahogany tree in the rainforests of Jamaica or the Mosquito Coast and the highly polished beauty of a costly table in the home of wealthy people in London or Philadelphia. Indeed, the chasm was so great in both geographic and metaphorical terms that it's unlikely that people saw the link. So just to conclude then that what we're trying to do then in James Walvin's terms is to see the links, to make those links visible and to avow those links in the interests, I think, both of a more honest approach to our history and in the interests of trying to not repeat the mistakes of the past and to create a more just and equal present. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's just a fascinating talk and just so much to explore and go over. Thank you so much for such an interesting introduction to this really expansive topic. So I suppose I might kick off with a question, and then please do everybody add in any more questions into the Q&A box that you have for Michael. I suppose I'm just interested. You said you have a background in history and English. You're based in a university. You've been researching this subject for a really long time, but recently it seems that you've become really interested in museum objects and I suppose in the material culture of this history. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on, why material culture or why objects are particularly powerful in talking about these histories and in avowing these histories.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, as I say, it's background in literature and history, and so yes, I do. I've been talking about museums and galleries. I talk about it like an amateur, which I do admit, and it probably comes across in the way that I do it. But I'm really just drawn to I think thinking about the role of museums and galleries because I've just I love them, and I've always gone since I was young and found them fascinating places, but also I think I've often been slightly kind of, you get that feeling of kind of awe and reverence that you can sometimes get in a museum or a gallery. And there's this feeling that this is a center of civilization, this is a center of culture, and you are here to kind of admire. And then I think, just as I've been kind of listening to critical scholars really kind of breaking down, well, wait a minute, is that really true that we just have to kind of sit in reverence and awe at these things, or should we be thinking far more critically about it? So I find that kind of flipping it round and that kind of subverting of the role of how we think about the broad kind of development of European societies, the broad development of what we think about civilization and culture, and thinking about processes about kind of exploitation and injustice, which has produced these exquisite, amazing artifacts. I find that a really compelling kind of way of doing it. And so, in particular, I think what I wanted to talk about today was the kind of the domestic setting, and these items which are real kind of household objects as a way to get over or to combat that kind of sense of disavowal and distancing. I think certainly when you hear the term slavery, your mind can go very quickly to images about kind of vast cotton plantations in Mississippi, and those quite iconic images from the United States. And so we have to work a bit harder to kind of really bring it home to the UK and bring it home to Scotland in particular, which has its own way of disavowing this kind of history. So I think it's the fact that it's kind of tactile as well. It's these things which you can, well, maybe you can't touch them if they're behind cases, but you can certainly imagine that they would have been like in your hands. And this is something which I think connects us kind of mentally and physically to this kind of history, which we really try to have to work so hard to acknowledge.
Absolutely. And just, thinking about museums too as being places that have, they have perpetuated these histories by displaying all of these objects and leaving these stories absent. So it is obviously a really important work for all museums, including us, to kind of start to try and explore everything you've been discussing and bringing it home, as you say, with these really domestic objects. There's a really good question from Fiona Dixon. I'm just going to read it out. How willing have you found museums or cultural institutions to have this slavery conversation, particularly if a more realistic picture of a wider Western culpability might be seen to ultimately lead to the repatriation of artifacts or national payments of reparations?
Wow. What a brilliant question. I think so. I started doing this kind of research, I think, in 2007, which was around the time of the abolition, the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. And it was really intriguing that museums were very interested in talking about abolition, and a lot less interested in talking about the slavery which came before it. And in the intervening decade and a bit, there's been kind of chipping away and increasing willingness on the part of, I think, some individual curators to really kind of take it seriously. And that was coming to a head, and it felt like the door was beginning to open very, very slowly. And then really, I think since the Black Lives Matter movement and that global surge of anti-racist activity, I think suddenly institutions got their act together a little bit more quickly. And so I certainly have seen it spreading rapidly at the moment. Now, I'm trying to think whether to be skeptical about it. There's a skeptical part of me which says that, listen, since the 1970s, 1980s, across particularly England and the United Kingdom, there's been a Black British arts movement which was putting on exhibitions and creating amazing cultural work and really pushing the cultural sphere to think about these things. And yet that can be temporary. And once that exhibition goes, then what's left in the actual kind of permanent record. And there can be a kind of a backsliding as soon as the political pressure eases off a little bit. Institutions can find themselves backsliding quite quickly. So I feel positive about the steps that have been positive about the overdue steps which have been taken at the moment, particularly here in Scotland. And I think we will have to all work hard to make sure that energy is maintained. The repatriation and reparations are the repatriation question. I think I'm not sure it would affect the objects in the Scottish Design Galleries, although I think it's well worth checking that out. You might have heard the story about the Benin bronzes just this morning being returned from University of Cambridge. University of Aberdeen has made those steps already, which is, for decades and decades, campaigners were arguing that those Benin bronzes should be returned, and they were just completely ignored. Quite amazing. And yet it seems like now, if you want to make an argument against repatriation, there might be good arguments against repatriation. I just can't think what they might be. It seems quite straightforward to me that if it, the kind of the moral case for it is very hard to argue against. And the larger question there about reparations, I think, is what kind of hangs over all of this stuff. And that certainly if you listen to the Centre for Reparations based in the Caribbean, they argue for all different forms of reparations. So that will be financial reparations, that will be social reparations, and also cultural reparations, which is kind of what we're involved with in the talk today, about thinking through the kind of the harm that some of these objects represent, and finding ways to try to repair, to try to heal a wound which has been left to fester for far too long.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had a few comments through from John, just I think reflecting on the word avowal and it being a kind of a way to heal, which I also really like. I've been visiting museums around the country looking at decolonizing projects in particular, and I think often the ones that are really effective are the ones where the sense of healing is kind of core to it, where it's trying to kind of I suppose grapple with those stories, but in a way that is I suppose just owned by artists and designers kind of commenting on these stories too. We've had a question in just about where we're at with our Transnational Scotland project, and just sort of explaining what we've been up to in the gallery. I'll just say a quick word about it, and then maybe you, Michael, can say how you've kind of felt, it's gone doing that work. But basically what we've been doing is working with a group of advisors, Michael being one of them, to change some of our labeling in the galleries, basically trying to do what Michael's been talking about, looking again at our objects and reframing them and trying to put stories of empire and slavery much more at the forefront of our interpretation. So that piece of an initial stab at that piece of work has been done, and it's accompanied by a film in the gallery with some more in-depth interviews. And then this series of lunchtime talks is also part of the project, in that we've been inviting the advisory group to come and explore these histories in more depth. And then coming up, I can't say too much because not everything is 100% confirmed, but we're looking at a commission and a residency as well in the museum, which will kind of further this work more. So we're really seeing it as a long-term process. As Michael was saying, often these things feel quite temporary when you visit museums. So we're trying really hard not to take that approach, and to try to embed this work in everything that we do, and for it to be an ongoing process. we've got another question in, Michael, as well. Maybe you can deal with both. A question about the Liverpool Museum to Slavery, and anticipating whether other British cities will kind of do the same. And I know you mentioned the move about having a museum in Glasgow. Are you able to kind of comment on the work you've been doing with us, and also this issue of whether a slavery museum in Scotland is something that should be progressed?
Well, I guess, yeah, with the V&A, it's been really instructive and great, and it's been, I think, what we've been looking at in particular is kind of changing labels and trying to use those labels. And I've certainly been very struck by the word limit that you guys are restricted to on how much you can actually put into those particular labels. And I think we're at the start of a process, but it's been really good to kind of feel that there is a kind of an openness to making those changes, which is room for optimism. My first job was actually in Liverpool. I used to stay in Liverpool for 4 years, so I know the museum very well. And it's a fantastic resource. It's wonderful that the City of Liverpool has it. If I could sound a note of caution, it was really striking to me that it's also controversial, even amongst the kind of the Black community in Liverpool, for the particular ways that it tells the stories, the particular ways, certain aspects which community activists wanted to be emphasised in the museum, and which they felt were not there, and a kind of a nervousness that if you've got a standalone museum, well, it's actually one floor of a whole set of museums down at the Albert Dock. There can be a feeling that, well, that does all the slavery stuff, and so then the other museums don't have to talk about it so much. So if you go to the Museum of Liverpool, which is just across the road for the dock, it's actually not really there quite so much. It's really only there in little traces. And so there can be a way of kind of siloing the story of slavery into that single standalone museum. So just the kind of lesson that I would take from that is that, like, absolutely support that there should be a standalone museum in Scotland, which focuses absolutely on Scotland's particular role, and that this should also be integrated throughout the way that all cultural and heritage organisations present their stories, that it shouldn't be something which becomes isolated, whether it's in Greenock or Glasgow or Edinburgh or Dundee or wherever else.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true, isn't it? 'Cause I remember a conversation we had with the advisory group where I was saying, do we need to have a case dedicated to this history in the gallery? And actually, one of the participants felt so strongly that that was the wrong way to go, and that, as you've just shown us this morning, that the objects they're dispersed all throughout the gallery, and actually, it's more helpful to kind of discuss it as it relates to all aspects of life, rather than separating it out. So that's a thought that's definitely stayed with me as we've been trying to kind of make some changes in our work. Unfortunately, we've actually reached 1 o'clock, so I'm really sorry if we didn't quite get to everybody's questions. Because it's just been so much to kind of discuss today. Before we do sign off, I just want to really thank Michael from all of us here at V&A Dundee. It's really been a fascinating conversation, and we really value all the work that we're also doing together in the galleries. We really hope that everyone has enjoyed the talk this afternoon. Please do have a look out for all the other events that we've got coming up. The next lunchtime talk, we're going to be joined by Bashabi Fraser, who is another member of our advisory group. She's a Professor Emerita of English and Creative Writing and Director of the Scottish Centre of Tagore Studies at Edinburgh Napier University. So you can keep an eye out, because there'll be details about this talk coming soon. All I have left to say really is just another thank you to Michael, and thanks for getting involved and asking all your questions today, everyone that's tuned in.